If N8N still feels like a math exam to you, that's not actually the problem. The overwhelm is just a symptom of something entirely different. When you open N8N and see all the nodes and connectors, your brain doesn't know how to organize any of it. It all blurs into one complicated mess because nobody ever showed you how those pieces actually fit together. N8N isn't one complicated tool. It's 5 simple layers stacked on top of each other. And once you see it that way, once you understand what each layer does and how they connect, that overwhelm disappears entirely. You stop seeing chaos and start seeing a system you can actually use and work with. So in this video, I'm breaking down all 5 layers from the ground up and showing you how N8N actually functions at a fundamental level. If you skip this and keep trying to learn N8N the way that feels right to you, you're going to stay stuck in that overwhelm for months. So what are the foundations of N8N? At the very base level, N8N is just a visual way to say when this happens, do that. That's really it. And the reason it feels confusing at first is because the screen is full of boxes, settings, lines, and JSON, but the idea underneath all of that is actually very simple. You're building a chain of steps. Something starts it, then a series of actions happens in order. If you can't hold that idea in your head, everything else in N8N is going to feel harder than it needs to be. But once that clicks, everything else becomes much easier. The first thing you need to understand is the trigger, because the trigger is the start button for every single workflow. The trigger answers one basic question: what needs to happen for this automation to run? That could be a schedule, a webhook, a new message, a form submission, or a new row in a spreadsheet. The specific trigger doesn't really matter yet. What matters is the role it plays. The trigger is the entry point that pulls the first piece of information into N8N and kicks off the run. Until that happens, nothing moves. Without a trigger, you don't actually have an automation, you just have a diagram sitting on the canvas. Once the trigger fires, the workflow moves into nodes. Nodes are the actual steps, the things that do the work. If the trigger is the moment the workflow wakes up, nodes are what it does after it wakes up. A node might send a message, create a record, fetch information from an app, or write something somewhere else. At this stage, you don't need to memorize what every node does. The only thing you need to understand is that N8N is built out of these small steps on purpose. Each node represents one clear action, and you connect them together to create the full process you want. The simplest way I've found to think about a workflow is that it's basically a straight line. It starts with a trigger, goes through a few nodes, and then it ends. That's the foundation. Later on, you can make it branch, loop, and handle edge cases, but that's all built on top of this basic idea. The foundation is still the same. The trigger starts the workflow, and the nodes execute in order. Now, when you're connecting nodes, you're going to run into something that trips a lot of people up early on, and that's credentials. Credentials aren't logic, they're permission. If you want a node to talk to Google, Slack, Airtable, or any other service, N8N needs a secure way to prove that it's allowed to do that. That's what credentials are. They're basically the keys that let your workflow access the outside world. Once you set them up, you usually reuse them across multiple workflows, which is why people spend time getting credentials right early instead of treating them as an afterthought. At this point, you've got the core pieces. When you put all of that together, you get a workflow. But now you've got a big decision to make. There are a few different ways you can run N8N, and on the surface, they all look pretty good. You can use the hosted cloud version, you can run it locally on your machine, or you can self-host it on your own server. I'm not going to spend too much time on the first two, because they fall apart pretty quickly once you start building real workflows. The hosted version is easy to start with, but you give up a ton of control and flexibility, and the cost efficiency gets really bad as you scale. You're limited on executions, limited on customization, and you're always boxed into someone else's rules. Running N8N locally sounds appealing at first, but it breaks down almost immediately. As soon as your laptop closes, your automations stop. That's why we're going to focus on the best option I've found, which is self-hosting. Self-hosting means you run N8N on your own server. It's always on, always reachable, and once you understand this setup, it becomes the default way you should think about using N8N. There are a few big reasons why self-hosting wins. First, control. You decide the version, the environment, and the integrations. Nothing changes unless you want it to. Second, cost. You're not paying per execution or per workflow. You're paying for a server, and that's almost always cheaper in the long run. Third, flexibility. Webhooks just work, long-running workflows work, background jobs work. And honestly, this is how N8N is meant to be used once you move past experiments. So let's walk through how to set it up. For hosting, we're going to use Hostinger. It's fast to set up, pricing is predictable, and it gives you exactly what N8N needs without extra complexity. When you click the first link in the description, you'll land on a page that's already set up for N8N. From there, you want to choose the KVM2 plan. The 2 CPU cores are more than enough for most workloads, and the 8 GB of RAM with 100 GB of disk space gives you plenty of room to grow. Once you choose the plan, you'll finish the setup, pick the server location closest to you, and select which version of N8N you want. You can use the standard version or the one that comes with workflows pre-installed. After that, you log into the server. Hostinger gives you the credentials directly, so there's no complicated setup here. From there, you log into N8N. You can create your first workflow. Just click this button right here, and now you're looking at your own N8N instance running on your own infrastructure. And now that N8N is live, the next thing you need to understand is how data actually moves through your workflows. Because if you don't understand that part, you won't be able to build anything useful. So let's actually understand what's happening whenever a workflow runs. Anytime a trigger fires, it doesn't just start the workflow, it brings data with it. That data is the input. And as you click through the nodes inside N8N, what you're really doing is watching that data get passed from step to step. If you look at the screen here and click into any node, there are three things happening. First, the node receives data from the previous step. Second, it does something to that data. And third, it outputs a result. That output then becomes the input for the next node. That's the entire idea of data flow. When people get stuck in N8N, it's usually not because the node itself is confusing. It's because they don't know what data is coming in or what shape that data is in. If you click on a node and look at the left side, you're seeing the input. This is whatever data was passed into the node from the previous step. On the right side, you're seeing the output, which is what this node produces after it runs. And in the middle, you've got the configuration, which is where you decide how the node should behave. That middle section is where almost all the work happens. This is where you map fields. Mapping fields just means telling N8N, take this value from the input and use it here. You're not creating data out of thin air, you're selecting pieces of existing data and deciding where they should go next. As you click around, you'll notice that almost everything is drag and drop. You grab a value from the input panel and drop it into a field. Sometimes the data is already in good shape and you just pass it through. Other times, you need to transform it. That could mean renaming fields, combining values, formatting text, or cleaning things up so the next node understands it. Under the hood, most of this data is represented as JSON. You don't need to be scared of that. JSON is just a structured way to describe information. When you see objects, arrays, and fields, all that means is N8N is being very explicit about what the data looks like. As workflows get more complex, you'll often need data from more than one place. Maybe one node pulls in user information and another pulls in transaction data, and you need both together. That's where merging inputs comes in. You're not changing the logic, you're just bringing multiple streams of data into a single step so you can work with them at the same time. The key thing to understand here is that N8N workflows don't think. They move data forward exactly the way you tell them to. But that raises the next question. If workflows don't think, how do you make decisions? How do you control what happens when something goes wrong or when data doesn't look the way you expect? So I've got this workflow open, and up until this point, as you can see, everything we've built has been pretty linear. The trigger fires, the nodes run in order, and the data just moves straight forward, and that works fine in theory. But workflows don't live in a perfect world. Data is messy, users do weird things, APIs fail, and if you don't account for that, your automations break the second you try to use them for something real. Control logic is how you tell N8N what to do when things aren't perfect. The most common place you'll see this is with conditions. If you look here and add a condition node, what you're really doing is saying, only continue if this is true. You're not changing the data at all. You're deciding whether it's allowed to move forward. So maybe you're checking if an email address exists. Maybe you're checking a status value. If the condition passes, the workflow keeps going. If it doesn't, it stops here or goes down a different path. That's the core of if-else logic. If this is true, go this way. If it's not, go that way. Switches work the same way, just at a bigger scale. Instead of one yes or no decision, you're checking one value against multiple possibilities. Think of it like routing traffic. Depending on what comes in, the workflow gets sent down a specific lane. Retries are another control you'll use a lot, especially when you're working with external services. If you click into a node's settings, you'll see options for retrying when something fails. This is N8N being practical. Sometimes an API times out, sometimes a service hiccups. A retry just says, try again before giving up. Error handling is where things really start to feel powerful. If you enable error handling on a node, you're telling N8N that if this step fails, don't just stop. Do something else instead. Maybe that means logging the error, sending a notification, or triggering a fallback workflow. You're no longer hoping things work. You're planning for when they don't. Wait states are another form of control that people underestimate. A wait node doesn't change the data at all. It just pauses the workflow. Maybe for a few minutes, maybe until a certain time. This is how you build workflows that behave like real processes instead of instant scripts. Approvals take that one step further. An approval step is basically saying, pause everything here until a human signs off. The workflow doesn't guess, it doesn't assume, it waits. And once approval happens, it continues exactly where it left off. The important thing to understand is that none of this is magic. You're not teaching N8N how to think. You're giving it clear rules. When this happens, happens, do this. When it doesn't, do that. When something breaks, handle it this way instead. And once you understand how data flows and how decisions are made, you're ready for the most powerful layer on top of all of this, making those decisions smarter instead of just stricter. That's where AI comes in. AI is what lets N8N handle the messy parts that rules alone can't. Inside N8N, an AI model is just another node in the workflow. It still receives input and it still produces output. The difference is what happens in the middle. Instead of transforming data in a fixed way, it interprets it. So if you pass in text, the model can summarize it, figure out what it's about, extract the important parts, or decide what matters. And this is important. AI doesn't replace your workflow logic, it feeds into it. If you look here at the AI node, everything the model sees comes from this input panel. That context matters more than the model itself. The clearer and more specific the input, the more useful the output becomes. So let's build a small example. I'm going to start with a trigger node and set it to run on a schedule every day at 8 a.m. That's just telling the workflow when to start. Next, I'm adding an AI node. Before anything else, we need to select a model. You do that right here by choosing a chat model. I'm going to use GPT 4.1, but you can choose whatever fits your use case. Now we need to tell the model what its job actually is. This is where prompting comes in. You don't need to be a prompt expert, you just need to be clear. So here, I'm saying, you are a world news analyst. Your task is to search for and summarize the most important global events from the last 24 hours. Focus on politics, technology, business, and science. Keep it structured and concise. Now, instead of manually giving it information, I'm going to give it a tool. This is important. When you give an AI access to tools inside N8N, you're not giving it freedom. The model can decide when to use a tool, but N8N is still the one that actually runs it. AI chooses, the workflow acts. At this point, the output of the AI node is just data, which means we can send it anywhere. So I'm adding one more node, a Slack node, and telling it to send the result directly to me. That's it. Let's run the workflow. Now you can see the execution finished, and here's the message. A clean summary of what happened in the world, delivered automatically without me checking 5 different news sites. Before AI, automation was about enforcing rules. Now, automation is about handling judgment, searching, interpreting, and still staying inside guardrails you control. And once you start thinking this way, workflows stop feeling mechanical and start feeling useful. Now imagine if you built out this entire workflow, got everything working perfectly, and then your laptop closed and the whole thing just stopped. Or you hit some random execution limit right when you actually needed it to run. That's exactly what happens when you try to run N8N locally or rely on the hosted version, which is why self-hosting on Hostinger is the only right move if you actually want your automations running 24/7 without any restrictions. So if you're ready to set up your own N8N instance the right way, go ahead and click the first link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.